I don't even know if I could.
Yes.
Hello, my name is Vanessa Obando with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. Today is July 14th, 2023. And today here we are at the Elaine Legacy Center in Elaine, Arkansas, and we'll be interviewing Andrea Gluckman. Could you spell your name for us?
Please. All right. So my name is Andrea Gluckman, Andrea Gluckman.
Okay, perfect. And we'll start off with just the general questions.
Sure.
What were your motivations to getting involved with Elaine, Arkansas? What is your connection here?
Great question. My family, my mother's family, which is the family that raised me, is from Phillips County. My grandfather, who lived with me until we all lived together until, just about a decade ago, he lived in Elaine. It was after the massacre, but, is deeply rooted in that area. And I spent most of my young adult life going back and forth between Helena and West Helena and Little Rock, where I grew up. So a lot of familial connections that led me to be even more horrified when I learned about the massacre a few years ago, which at least in my experience in talking with people is fairly common, that a lot of people who are connected didn't know about the massacre until a few years ago. So so I cold called Mary Olson. I cold called a number of people and just kind of said, hey, you don't know me. These are the things that I can kind of do professionally. What, are any of those interesting, and can I throw them your way? And she's like, heck yeah, man. So I came down and been working with them ever since.
Perfect. And what has your work looked like here at the Elaine Legacy Center?
Great question. It honestly has looked like whatever they need me to do, or whatever could be helpful. So the premise that I'm trying to work from, but I take my leads always from them, from Mary, from James, from Faye, from Miss Lenora, is I don't want to, whatever it is should not be extractive. That's like number one. So what is it that I can offer that may or may not be helpful? And so that started off being photography, because I'm a photographer. And she's like, Mary said, why don't you go and take pictures of where we think these mass graves are? And then that led to a lot of intensive time with descendants, which was absolutely incredible. And that led to stories, and that led to other projects. So it started off through kind of a creative representation of a lot of the stories. And then that led to, people needed a website, and then needed marketing materials, needed, again, whatever it was. And then that kind of built on itself and led to kind of larger scale projects like the One Nation, One Project, or the National Endowment for the Humanities exhibit. All good things start with art, y'all.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on those projects?
Sure. The National Endowment for the Humanities, there was a grant that was procured before I came along that was specifically through the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So essentially, what the community did was come together and get oral histories surrounding a physical building in Elaine. And I hope that y'all have seen it. And if not, you need to. So we're going to make sure y'all see it. And that will be the home of the Elaine Museum and Richard Wright Civil Rights Center. It's currently still under construction. So the grant was to tell the story of preservation. And so the idea was, okay, great, but we're going to tell the story of Elaine through the story of this building. So we really worked on everybody, divided up the research, collected, everything from deeds to online research, and the big, like the meatier part of it being the oral histories from people's interactions, not just with that building, but the people who owned the building at the time. What was Elaine like as a thriving Black business community during different periods of time? How did things change after the massacre? What about the decay after, the most recent owners left Elaine and until the building was purchased? So basically, like telling the history of community through the eyes of this building. It was fascinating. And it was truly a communal project too, because everybody was either giving stories, but maybe they were collecting stories, getting photographs from their attics. It was quite something. It was awesome to be involved with. And so what I did was we were going to have a big physical exhibit, but as you can see, our building was not ready for that. So we changed it into an online exhibit, which I think ended up being a good thing because it's more accessible. We could add podcasts, videos. We have Julia Wright, giving a video. We have the wonderful Paul Ortiz giving a really interesting assessment of what a museum or a kind of a connection point like the museum could be for rural Southern areas with these types of histories that need to be surfaced. So that was that. And hopefully there'll be follow-ons. I did a walking tour thing, which I'd be happy to send to y'all, with the help of James White. And it is really, really fun. So for people who come into Elaine and are on a pilgrimage of sorts, but don't have a connection actually in the town, they're standing there at the crossroads of that, one intersection going, what the heck? Where do I go? That will be a tool for people to be able to enter into learning more about the town and the history. The One Nation, One Project is a creative placemaking project that is designed. It's a national project. Phillips County was one of the initial 9 cohorts chosen. And the idea is, how can exposure to creative endeavors or art or whatever you want to call it make communities healthier? And so that's what we're doing. And we're doing it around the issue of water, which y'all know, both in terms of infrastructure and in terms of, culture, geographical, spiritual elements, is one of the richest topics and most urgent topics in Phillips County.
So to backtrack a little bit to something you said earlier, you mentioned that you had reached out to Dr. Olson after finding out about the massacre. How did you discover and learn about this massacre? And if you could pinpoint exactly when this occurred?
Sure. I am thinking, I'm trying to place it. It must have been 2017, 2018. So, recent. And I read about it on the internet, which is so ridiculous, when you think about it. I came through Elaine my whole life, and it just was not, and not for nothing, y'all, but I consider myself to be fairly well informed. I'm certainly not, a total ostrich here with my head in the ground. All my work is on, political science and social justice and whatever. So it's not, I should have known, and I didn't. And it was incredibly troubling for a number of reasons. So first thing I did was I called my family up, those who are still living. And I'm like, why is nobody talking about this? And they all said, literally all my cousins, uncles, everybody said, what are you talking about? And granted, most of them, they didn't grow up in Elaine, but they grew up in Phillips County. And the people who would have been living there, very soon after the massacre, or, knowing people who were there during that time, of course, are all gone. But it's really hard for me to metabolize that, nobody in my family would know, like just that no one would know anything. So that's why that day I called Mary and got her voicemail. And then I just went to Arkansas anyway. And I kept calling her. And then she finally called me back. I mean, her, she's been doing this work.
Sorry. Yeah, she definitely has. Do you think this is a common experience amongst the white residents of Phillips County and Elaine? Do you think that there's a sort of ignorance or just, unbeknownst to the information and history of the massacre?
Yes. I mean, again, this is just my assessment as somebody who, I haven't lived in Arkansas in decades because I left after college and I go back to visit, but, I'm in New York. So I don't want to speak for those communities. However, what I can say is that I think absolutely that is indicative. I would also say that it was not something talked about in a number of communities of color either. Different reasons, different histories, different motivations, different types of not knowings, right? But it is, there's a very specific reason why this is not something that was known until recently. And I would credit the work of the Legacy Center seriously as the main factor in getting the information out nationally and internationally, because that, I will often hear the refrain from other people who are working on Red Summer issues or, anything from Tulsa to Montgomery to whatever. I will hear people say, oh yeah, well, the past few years it's really been pushed out into the national spotlight. Oh, I've read about it in the media. The same times that I started reading about it. And it really is, in my opinion, the Legacy Center that did that. And so I think that, what the white community or white communities may or may not know now, that type of ignorance, I think, would be different than the type of ignorance that predated the work of the Legacy Center, if that makes any sense. And I'm not assigning a moral value to either one. I'm just acknowledging that there's a difference. It would be hard now, I think, for people to claim ignorance about the massacre if you read, because it's just, it's available and out there. Now, I'm not sure if you have been acquainted with the Hush Mouth campaign. And the Hush Mouth campaign was the deliberate silencing of Black communities and of white communities who were not a part of the massacre to specifically not speak there. And I can send y'all any information that you want. There is an incredible story by one of the descendants, Linda Shelby, that's on YouTube. It was not collected by y'all. Y'all may have one of her too, but it was at an event that we did last September, where she very clearly goes through why people didn't speak about it and why people continue not to speak about it. And, it's complex, as you can appreciate. So yes, long way to answer your question. Yes, I think it is endemic. I think the reasons for white communities not knowing now is different than before, knowing that the information is out and available now. I think this is the moment that it needs to be pushed out as much as possible, because people are listening and metabolizing in different ways now.
Right. So why do you think it's important for us to, be able to preserve these legacies and, as you mentioned, push out what happened of this massacre?
Well, that is just a great question. And I think y'all could probably answer it better than me doing the awesome work that you're doing. But I'm a firm believer that history is not neutral, that museums are not neutral, that oral history to me is history. I'm like, Paul Ortiz, in terms of how this sounds so cliche, but how the history of the people is the history that needs to be known and needs to be pushed out into the public eye. So as a sociologist or anthropologist, I understand that understanding how different groups of people would narrate their own history is important, being if it's the power narrative of, what people have been saying for years now about the massacre, which I think is not accurate. The purely sharecropping narrative, the fact that it was, some people call it a riot, or a Black uprising, that narrative, it's important to understand why people had that narrative, but clearly I don't believe that is the accurate narrative. So I think what you all are doing in terms of preserving stories around people's actual experiences and how people tell their own history is the way that history should be done anyway. I think it's the way that all history should be done. I do think it's important, again, to understand that power narrative, because those are the systems that shape us and what we do in the confines in which we have to operate. But it was funny, I was talking with somebody about the ideas of having this museum in Elaine, and they're like, well, what kind of artifacts are you going to put in there? And I was like, what do you mean? That's what makes a museum. I'm like, well, what does that mean? The whole idea of history has to look and sound and smell and feel like a certain type of authenticated process to be real. And, I just feel like we've been going about museums and history all wrong. And there's nothing that I would love more than to see the oral histories, the stories, in that museum, because that's the history of the United States, right?
And beyond the massacre, do you think that the white residents of Phillips County are also unaware of certain issues that are disproportionately affecting the Black residents of Phillips County? Like, I know you mentioned the water crisis. Could you speak a little bit more on that and what that's looking like?
Yes. So the first part of that question, absolutely. I do think there are massive gaps in understanding of what the inequities are. And it, pops out in any kind of thematic conversation, if it's about food, if it's about healthcare, accessibility, water. What I would say that I find interesting and, indicative of where things are is that part of that gap is narrowing, not necessarily people's experience, but when you get to issues like water, in certain places like West Helena, water has been an issue for decades and decades and decades, and particularly in places that, you'll find this out, but like Lakeview or places that are predominantly Black areas have had these issues and struggled with infrastructure and being under-resourced and not resourced for decades. But now that it's reaching other parts of the county where all kinds of demographics are being affected, it is in the news more, it is being talked about more. So yes, I think that a lot of white communities are not aware of all the inequities. They are starting to experience some of the infrastructural challenges that other communities have had. So I don't know that people are necessarily understanding because of like communal empathy and critical thinking, but they're experiencing some of those same things. So that's one. In terms of the water crisis, it's complex like everything, and that's why there's not a quick fix. I think it's something that has been a long time in coming. I would call it like a slow motion crisis. So there's not one person, one official, one city council to blame. It's, a lot of people share the blame in what I think is truly just like a massive act of negligence. So one aspect of it is that stuff that should have been done hasn't been done. The filters weren't clean, equipment wasn't kept up to date. There's a massive lack of just human capacity, human resources, getting people in to commit and stay in Phillips County who have training. People who are there haven't had access to training. So there's this human capacity, there's the infrastructure negligence, there's everything being under-resourced. And something that people don't talk about as much is that these rural water associations, they're city stuff, y'all, but there's also the rural water associations. And you got to remember that sometimes this is the only source of income for cities or small towns. So then there's also a power issue at play where people see this as potentially losing income for their area, meaning, officials, mayors, etc. So it's just kind of a hot mess, which you'll see. And it is the result of a number of factors, a lot of negligence. And it is indicative, I think, of broader things that are happening in Phillips County as the demographics, it's just bleeding out people, right? And then you get into the cycle of there aren't jobs, but you can't recruit people for jobs because the water sucks. And then you can't recruit people to come in and work at the hospital, so the hospital closes down, and then more people leave. And it's, part of that rural journey, I think, that's happening in a lot of places in the States, but definitely in the Delta.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if you have been made aware, but there are currently efforts that some community organizers, as of very recently, are trying to mobilize to be able to get petitions to get, I believe it's the governor, to invest some of the 1.1 billion surplus that they have into rebuilding the infrastructure of the water systems. Do you think this would be a step in the right direction to be able to help Elaine?
I do. I am not going to lie and say I have zero faith in that particular governor. Maybe less than zero. However, response, going through those channels, I think, is absolutely one of the right impulses. Absolutely. And community organizing, I think, is never a bad thing. I used to be an ACORN organizer, so I'm, direct organizing, firm believer, Saul Alinsky's techniques, I'm there. At the same time, it's going to be important to build out in a number of other ways as well. I think the fact that the state has that surplus is just mind-boggling. And I think absolutely it should be demanded and asked. And I think pressure's the way to do it. I don't think, anybody can sit around and wait for, the goodness of the, this particular government anyway, to look at Phillips County, which is the bluest and the blackest county in Arkansas, the only blue county, I think. I could be wrong about that, in Arkansas, and be like, yeah, sure, we're gonna help you out. And so pressure has to be applied. I don't think it can be counted on at all. And I've been an advocate for getting the EPA in there and getting, the visibility that Jackson and Flint had. And I know that that's a whole other set of problems. And I think they can be pursued simultaneously. I just worry, people in Phillips County are tired. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, not at all. So what are some of the other avenues that you alluded to that you think we should be that the people of Elaine should be taking to be able to help Elaine, and what should people outside of Elaine be doing, both white allies, brown allies, everybody, what should we, be doing in the future to be able to help this community?
Now, do you mean in terms of water, sweetie, or do you mean in general?
In general, if you...
In general.
Yeah.
Well, I would definitely say that I know folks there would know better than me. So I would stand in line to give my opinion. But one thing that I found to be that I believe anyway is helpful is somebody who's in this weird position of being from there, but not there, of there, but not in there. You know what I mean? I come often, but yet I don't have to drink the water and be there, etc. But the story, it sounds really cliche, but it's keeping this shit in people's faces all the time. It's bringing the stories up. It's always connecting it back. It's, not just bringing the story, but bringing people there. Because I would imagine that y'all can appreciate, because you're, the work that you're doing and you're on site, that being there is an incredibly powerful experience. And a lot of the conversations I've had with folks there about, if you had your druthers, how would you like to see the city develop, and what does that mean, and how could it be responsible, and how could it not be extractive, and how could it be inclusive, and all of these things. And what I have heard from people essentially is that kind of spaghetti against the wall. Let's see what sticks. And that's because they've tried so many things. I mean, the most freaking, persevering people in the world are in Elaine, Arkansas, because they have tried everything. And what seems to be sticking at the moment is, and I think it's beautifully and culturally timely and ironic, is the fact that people wanting to surface histories is what might actually bring the town back. I mean, it should be, but you can't, you never know what that's going to be. There has to be an anchor for development. And that very well could be the museum. It very well could be heritage tourism, which again, in the South, oh my God, like this is not the kind of heritage tourism that a lot of people are used to, thank God. And, it's gaining traction. People show up in Elaine. And if we can get people there, we can tell the stories, then, there's going to have to be a hotel. Y'all aren't staying in Elaine, are you? I mean, there's nowhere to be. There's Rel's, which is like a little place where you can get some food, but I mean, there's not a full-on restaurant. There's not a school. And the school that's far away is, there's all drama about that, which I'm sure you've heard. So we've got to start somewhere. And what I am trying to do is just follow the lead of folks who are there, asking them what is sticking, what is salient, what is gaining traction from the outside, which again is telling the story. And the idea of the museum, the idea of heritage tourism, the idea of becoming part of this circuit of people wanting, just putting their resources out on the table to take their families to Montgomery and Selma and Memphis and whatever. And I'm not talking even just Southerners, but I mean, people know about it now. And how can we use that to build the town up in a way that the town wants to be built up?
That's very beautifully put. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Basically, just listen to the people there.
Yeah, no, certainly. Great advice to go by, especially when, considering how to rebuild these communities. It's to ask the people who live there. So
that's right.
Thank you so much for all those very comprehensive answers.
Sure.
I think that's about
sums up our questions. And is there anything that else that you would like to add or comment on or share?
I'm thinking. I'm sure there are so many, but I won't. Other than just the county itself, one thing that I have learned and really beginning to appreciate in a way that I didn't before is the challenges of telling rural histories. A lot of the work that I do is in, crafting narratives and trying to creatively help uplift those and present them artistically in community with, the communities who are involved. So not coming in and creating something. But the challenges, one of the challenges I didn't expect to be as present as it is, really doing anything in very, very rural communities, from logistics to community outreach to organizing events to the art, the creative and artistic aspects of performance and thinking about, it's really, really hard not to be extractive. And that's a commitment that we all have to make. And so that's not me really adding value to this conversation, but it's me presenting another challenge that I have found after these past few years in working there, and the constant being on the outside trying to get things done inside the county when there's constantly crisis. It's constant.
Mm-hmm.
That's why there have to be a bunch of us doing it. Thank you.
Right. Yeah. A lot to think about. But once again, thank you so much for your time. And this concludes our interview.
Thank you so much.
Play the middle or the top? Oh my goodness.